ain't nobody worried about Russell Wilson.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I have been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 18 years, almost a lifetime. Formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast each and every day. And I think each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. That means you make it your first watch or first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I thought today's episode, we'd be starting out talking about the practice squad. Maybe we will. Maybe I'll reshuffle the order of this episode if that gets announced. But I'm recording this after 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday. And so far, they haven't announced it. So we'll move on and talk about the things that are going on, not in Atlanta, but in Pittsburgh, right? Where we'll talk a little bit about Russell Wilson being named the starter for week 1 for the Pittsburgh Steelers, what that means for the Falcons defense, especially at the linebacker position, as well as talking about, Arthur Smith in Atlanta or Arthur Smith in Pittsburgh and sort of the differences between what we expect from Arthur Smith's offense in Pittsburgh, basically the same as what we thought it would be in Atlanta, and what we're expecting from Zac Robinson's offense in Atlanta. So without further ado, let's talk about Russell Wilson being named the starter. And I think that has, impact on one specific thing. And it's how the Falcons are going to deploy their linebackers, right? This is Nate Landman's time to shine rather than, say, Troy Anderson's time to shine. And we touched upon this briefly on Monday's episode. But I think with Russell Wilson being named the starter, you're not as concerned about the quarterback mobility as you were if Justin Fields was going to be named that. And I think your defensive game plan, if you're Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake, can really center on stopping the run in Arthur Smith's offense. We know Arthur Smith loves to use 12, 13, 21, and 22 personnel, these sort of these offensive formations that allow defenses to play a lot of base defense. That was 80% of the Falcons offense last year. I don't think it's going to be quite to that degree in Pittsburgh, but it'll probably still be somewhere around like 60% of their offense. And so having a downhill run thumper like Nate Landman will be a lot more beneficial. Now, there is suggestions that they will have a package for Justin Fields. I think my guess is that will probably be maybe a short yardage or red zone package or whatever. And, that will be an opportunity for someone like a Troy Anderson to potentially spy the quarterback if those are passing situations as opposed to running situations where he can be a factor in there. And I do think as the season progresses, we could see a lot more of Troy Anderson, especially given the quarterback mobility that we're expected to see from Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes in weeks 2 and 3. Having a guy like Troy Anderson that can spy those guys and potentially take those guys in the open field, it's going to be a lot more valuable. Now, we'll see about weeks 4 and 5 when we play the Saints and Bucks because, they have new offensive coordinators. We'll see what their offenses are. Will they be as reliant on the run game as the Steelers are or whatever? And will that be the centerpiece of the defensive game plan? We'll see, right? Again, we'll just have to wait and see how the next couple of weeks play out to sort of judge what Clint Kubiak's and Liam Cohen's Saints and Bucks offense respectively look like. But, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how the Falcons deploy their linebackers this season, right? When specifically talking about Landman and Anderson, I think Caden Ellis's role is going to be basically the same as what it was last year. There's a lot of parallels between how Ryan Nielsen used Caden Ellis last year and how Raheem Morris used Ernest Jones last year. The team has been a lot cagier about who's going to play next to Caden Ellis this year, right? Is Landman the starter? Is Troy Anderson the starter? Again, we don't really know. And it may be a situation where we might alternate week to week depending on the matchup. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here, where I think against Pittsburgh, that's a Nate Landman game. Philadelphia, that's a Troy Anderson game. I think Kansas City's more of a Troy Anderson game. We'll see about some other games later in the season. I think the Chargers, maybe the Saints, we'll see, is more of a Nate Landman game. We'll have to sort of see. But, I know there's been a lot of talk this offseason about the Falcons using all three guys on the field at the same time, Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, and Nate Landman. As I've said before, I don't really buy this. Again, I think there might be something that we can use on occasions. There might be a package of plays, similar to what we're talking about with Justin Fields, like, 3, maybe 5 plays a game where you might see all three of these guys on the field. That's about 5 to 8% of their plays. I think that can be a valuable changeup for your defense and potentially a curveball for offenses. But I don't think that's going to be like a core element of how this defense is going to play this year. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Now, you compare that to their usage of 3 safety looks. That's going to be a key element, more of a core element of their defense in all likelihood, given that the Falcons played a lot of dime last year, 19%, the 9th most in the NFL last year. The Rams, 18%, the 11th most in the NFL last year. They did sprinkle in the Falcons, that is, sprinkle in some big nickel late in the season after the bye week, but it was usually 1 or 2 times in that. And so to me, based off of that, like, I'm expecting that Falcons' third safety, in this case, Richie Grant, is going to have a much bigger role in this defense than whoever is that backup linebacker is, right? And so if you're an everydayer of this pod, like, I think the backup linebacker should be Nate Landman, right? But we'll see. Week 1 probably should be Troy Anderson, just based off of this Russell Wilson matchup. So we'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. Now, maybe, we get a month into the season, I'm like, oh man, I underestimated Nate Landman, and he's played much better than I thought he would, and he should be the starter for the rest of the season. We'll see if I'm singing those praises, or we're like, man, we need Troy Anderson to step up, or whatever the case may be. So those are the interesting unknown things sitting here in late August that we don't know about the season. We'll have a better idea about that once we get into September and October and November. But with the Steelers announcing Russell Wilson as a starting quarterback, that to me is the main concern with him. I don't think it really changes much in terms of how you defend the pass, because in both cases, you're worried about the deep ball with Wilson, with Justin Fields. With Fields, you were much more worried about his ability to extend plays outside the pocket. Wilson can do that stuff better than your average NFL quarterback, but he's not to the degree that he was in his prime in Seattle. And that's a big reason why his play has diminished so much, because so much of his success in Seattle was that play extension ability, and then heaving up deep balls to Tyler Lockett and Doug Baldwin and DK Metcalf and all those guys and whatnot. And I don't think you have to worry about that nearly as much moving forward. So that will be something that we'll continue to explore as we get closer to that week 1 game, how different things affect this matchup. One of those things that we'll talk about is how this Falcons defense matches up with Arthur Smith and his offense, and why I'm not particularly scared of Arthur Smith's offense, but why I'm particularly excited about what Zac Robinson's offense is going to look like here in Atlanta. So back in the day when I used to get up early in the mornings for my day job at like 4 or 5 p.m. and drive a couple hours to do my work, and I won't bore you with the details, but 5-hour energy was crucial for me back then. I hit a couple of coffees early in the morning. That would be fine through the drive, but then I wouldn't get a break at my job until after lunchtime. And to get through that time, 5-hour energy was so crucial. And now I'm less concerned about having the energy early in the mornings through lunchtime. And it's about having energy later in the day. And that's where 5-hour energy continues to help me out, also giving me that energy on the rare occasions when I hit the gym. And with zero sugar, convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. They have flavors galore on their website, like watermelon, tropical burst, grape, berry used to be my go-to, and so much more. You can go to the website and build your own 12 or 24 pack. You can choose the flavors and have it delivered right to your door. Head to 5hourenergy.com. That's the number 5hourenergy.com and get some product today. You can use the promo code LOCKEDONFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. Just go to 5hourenergy.com today. So one of the questions we have heading into week 1 is, how will this Falcons defense hold up against Arthur Smith and his offense? And I'm going to relate this to something that's somewhat topical that we haven't discussed on this podcast, but maybe others have elsewhere on the Locked On Podcast Network. And it's the QB tiers that came out from The Athletic this week. They usually drop those in July, but for whatever reason, they were dropped in late August. And for those of you that didn't check it out or don't have Athletic subscriptions, and I sit here and I go like, if you're a football obsessive or a sicko like most of us, myself and many of you watching, I don't know why you aren't getting The Athletic. It's great resource, but it is what it is. Money is tight. I know how it goes. But Kirk Cousins was a tier 2 quarterback, and he ranked 13th. I think that's a fair ranking for Kirk Cousins. And, I'm going to use the tiers to compare Arthur Smith versus Zac Robinson. And I think Arthur Smith was a tier 3 play caller, and the hope is that Zac Robinson is a tier 2 play caller. Now, the definition of a tier 3 quarterback was, and we're applying this to play callers, is a tier 3 quarterback is a legit starter, but needs a heavier run game or defensive component to win. Lower volume drop back passing offense suits him best. And I think that describes Arthur Smith's offense to a T. For a tier 2, which we hope Zac Robinson is, that's a quarterback, in this case, play caller, that can carry his team sometimes, but not as consistently, can handle pure passing situations in doses, and or possesses other dimensions that are special enough to elevate them above tier 3. He has a hole or two in his game. So essentially, very good quarterback, tier 2, but not quite elite like the tier 1 guys are, right? Tier 1, Patrick Mahomes. In terms of play calling, that's Kyle Shanahan, that's Andy Reid, that's Sean McVay, that type of guy. Now, the tier 3 quarterbacks, to sort of understand, if you didn't check out the article that we're comparing Arthur Smith to, that's Tua, Trevor Lawrence, Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, Derek Carr, Geno Smith, Russell Wilson. The tier 2 quarterbacks were Lamar Jackson, Matthew Stafford, Justin Herbert, Aaron Rodgers, CJ Stroud, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Jalen Hurts, Brock Purdy, Kirk Cousins, and Jordan Love. Right? And so, for me, when I look at what this tier 3 is, right, and why I defended Arthur Smith's play calling last year was because, I thought he was a capable play caller, but he wasn't a great play caller. I never thought he was a great play caller, even when we hired him. Right. And I know fans tend to see these things as black and white, where you're either the greatest thing in the world or you're the worst thing in the world. There's no sort of gray area. We live in the gray here on Locked On Falcons, your team every day. And, I remember when we hired Arthur Smith, a lot of people were kind of hyping him up as this, the next Shanahan or whatever. And I think that was just mostly because people were looking at the stats from his offenses in Tennessee and not really watching the film. Right. And one of the things that we talked about was the intentionality. That's been a buzzword on this podcast over the years, which is the intentionality of your play calling, which is the idea focusing on your ability to dial up explosive plays, which is kind of the core of what elevates the top tier offenses and play callers from the bottom tier offenses. And it's the idea of, when you're calling a play, is it with the intention, with the goal of being explosive, or you just explosive as a byproduct? And too often, whether we're talking about Arthur Smith's offense in Tennessee, Atlanta, and I expect it not to change in Pittsburgh, is that his offense survived and was succeeding because he had dudes, right? Guys that were turning, like we saw last year with Jonnu Smith, turning a screen into a 60-yard touchdown or whatever. Right. And you saw that in 2019 in his first year as a play caller in Tennessee, right? That week 1 game where they put up a lot of points against the Browns, it was mainly because Derrick Henry was being a dude. And then they didn't win another game. Their offense struggled for the next couple of weeks. And then they beat the Falcons, unfortunately, still salty about that game, mainly because A.J. Brown was cooking Desmond Trufant. And you saw the same thing with his 2021 start in Atlanta, where it was a slow start outside of one quarter against the Bucs. And then you started to see the offense start to come alive in week 4. Thanks in large part to Cordero Patterson. You saw Mike Davis get a touchdown where he trucked 4 guys on a check down and whatnot. Then week 5, week 6, the offense exploded, or week 5, week 7, whenever we had the bye week somewhere in there. But those next 2 games against the Jets and Dolphins, those were the games where Kyle Pitts really went off. And I expect the same thing with the Pittsburgh, right? My worry about the Steelers offense is, George Pickens mossing a guy 40 yards down the field. Or if Justin Fields was going to be the quarterback, it would be him turning what a would-be sack into a 20-yard game, which we saw him seemingly do a couple of times against the Falcons last year when he was with the Chicago Bears. And even before the Falcons signed Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons, given that style of offense, I was optimistic that the Falcons defense, even though I had major concerns about that defense over the course of the season, in this specific matchup against that type of offense and that caliber of play calling from Arthur Smith, I felt confident that they would be able to slow down, or I felt optimistic. Confident, not the right word. I'm never confident about anything with the Atlanta Falcons. 30 years of fandom has taught me never to be confident about anything. But I was optimistic that the Falcons would be able to slow down that offense. And now adding a pass rusher like Judon, another playmaker like Justin Simmons, makes me even more optimistic of that. So we'll see if the Falcons can do that and slow down a tier 3 play caller like Arthur Smith. But let's talk about our tier 2 play caller and Zac Robinson. And as I said, those are typically, so, when we talk about the quarterbacks, it's the top 4 through 14 quarterbacks, as I named earlier. And we're hoping that we'll get this level of play calling from Zac Robinson where you have a lot more intentionality in the play calling. And to me, the other sort of tier 2 play callers, that, where I'm comparing Zac Robinson and other guys like Bobby Slowick, Todd Monken, Ben Johnson, right? Matt LaFleur, Kevin O'Connell, Shane Steichen, Mike McDaniel, Sean Payton. These are the guys that are consistently putting their teams in positions to succeed because I think they have that sort of intentionality in their offense. That to me is what separates a tier 2 play caller from a tier 3 play caller. Now, we don't know if Zac Robinson is going to be that guy because he's never been a play caller before. But of course, hope springs eternal when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons. And I think this is going to be the real difference for this team moving forward. If this team is successful in the early years of Raheem Morris, and we'll see, how that plays out over time, because again, the expectation, again, we'll see if this is the reality, but the expectation is Zac Robinson's going to be the next hot commodity as a head coach and won't be a long-term piece here in Atlanta. And so then we'll be having this conversation again when it comes to whoever's going to replace Zac Robinson in the future. But again, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So, I think Zac Robinson has the capacity to be that sort of tier 2 play caller, that he's going to, and again, to me, again, we'll see if this plays out. But to me, what I'm expecting is him being at tier 2. And to me, the real question is, how high in that tier? Is he like the top of tier 2, like Mike McDaniel is, where his offense is taking the league by storm and everybody's like, we gotta steal from this, and what the things that Zac Robinson is doing is so innovative and we have to copy it? Or is it just like it's a good solid offense and like that's to me when I watch Bobby Slowick's offense or Kevin O'Connell's offense, it works. It's a good offense, but it's not necessarily like, oh, this is the most dynamic offense I've ever seen in the history of sports within that tier 2. So there are tiers within the tier. So, what I'll wrap up in saying is, like, to me, this is the bet that I've been saying this all offseason. Like, it's less about Kirk Cousins and the new weapons and all the stuff. This is really the bet that the Falcons are making this season. It's really resting on Zac Robinson being that dude, because as I've watched the Falcons over the last 7 years, I've heard so many people talk up this Falcons talent every single year going into every season. And like, this talent is special and this talent is great. And I remember vividly in 2017, when coming off the heels of that Super Bowl, and I understood it, so I didn't really push back too hard against it because we all went through some psychological trauma that offseason. But, a lot of people were pushing how that roster was the most talented roster that we had seen in Atlanta in like 20 years. And I don't think it was a wrong assessment of the team, but in the years since, people have been hyping up the talent. And it's like, and again, I know you guys think I'm just hating when I say stuff like this, but it's like, there's nothing special about this particular Falcons roster, at least on the offensive side of the ball. Again, we can talk about, what's special about having two safeties like Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates, or having a pass rusher like Matthew Judon, which is not something that we normally have. But then again, you go back to 2020, the same things that people were saying about Matthew Judon today, people were saying about Dante Fowler then. But I think it's more deserving with Matthew Judon today than it was with Dante Fowler then. But we'll see how that all plays out. But, I think people think I'm hating when I say this, but I don't think people learned the lessons, because we saw, that team make the playoffs in 2017, but it was, a massive drop-off, in terms of the offense, in large part due to the play calling, right? When it comes to offense, it's less about talent, it's less about the Jimmies and Joes, and it's more about the X's and O's. Now, that script flips when you talk about the defense, is what I believe. But, I don't think people have really learned those lessons. And so whenever I see people hyping up the Falcons talent level, especially this year's team, and again, this is not me hating, it's just like, there's nothing special. Like, that's why I've meant when you've heard me say things like, yeah, we've had Matt Ryan, we've had Julio Jones, we've had Calvin Ridley. Like, we've had more talented offenses than what we're trotting out on the field this year. And so if this team is successful, what we have today that's different from those previous years is we have Zac Robinson versus Arthur Smith versus Steve Sarkisian versus Dirk Cutter, right? Like, that's the thing that's changed. And so that's the thing that we need to focus on. So we'll see how Zac Robinson and the rest of this offense performs this upcoming season. But, I'm very optimistic that we're going to see, this offense be very effective this year, be in the upper half of the league. It just sort of, to me, the question is, are we the 14th best offense, or, could we be the 4th best offense? Again, I'm not expecting that, but again, it's a possibility. So that to me is something that is really what's in store for this upcoming season. And we'll just sort of see how it all plays out. I think the challenge against the Steelers in week 1 is really going to be, can the offensive line control the line of scrimmage in the ways that they need to against a very formidable Steelers front? And we'll explore that topic more and more as we get closer to that game. So that's going to be, to me, the biggest challenge. So if the offensive line can hold their own, and Zac Robinson is doing his thing as a play caller, then I certainly think, this offense can cook and do some things and come away from that week 1 game with a win. And then we'll just sort of have to see if we can keep pace with, presumably better offenses. We'll see. I tend to think Kellen Moore is a high level tier 3 play caller for the Eagles, but we know Andy Reid's a tier 1 guy. So we'll see how that all plays out. But those are my kind of thoughts on, how we sort of match up, how the differences in the play callers. Again, I never thought Arthur Smith was a bad play caller, but he was just like, he was in that same tier that Sark and Dirk Cutter was, which is, those guys primarily were thriving off of having a player like Julio Jones. And unfortunately for the Falcons, as much as we wanted Kyle Pitts and Drake London and Bijan Robinson to be those guys, they weren't on that Julio Jones level. And again, Julio Jones he's on the GOAT wall for a reason, guys. So, well, again, hopefully one day we'll be able to put pictures of Bijan and Kyle and Drake up there, but I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath, at least in the meantime. Bijan, we'll get to a Bijan conversation at some point before week 1. So he's the thing that's, particularly exciting, but we'll leave that aside. So the Falcons have finally announced their practice squad, at least 13 of those players, and we'll break down who made it and who didn't. So, guys, it is the time of year when we're all looking to get back into the stadium, especially Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and Gametime is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. Whether you want to get into the stadium this weekend to watch Georgia take on Clemson, or you want to get back in the stadium to see the Falcons beat the Pittsburgh Steelers, Gametime is going to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, right? And whether you're into football, baseball, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Gametime is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. What do I mean when I say they're taking the guesswork out of buying tickets? What you see is what you get, right? You can get their panoramic seat view, so you know exactly what your event is going to look like before you buy. You don't have to worry about hidden prices at checkout. They have their all-in prices. You can shop flash deals, so you can save on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. So to take advantage of this offer, just download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. So it took about until 6 p.m. on Wednesday for the Falcons to finally announce it. So we got 13 of the 16 names on the Falcons practice squad. And those are running back Carlos Washington Jr., wide receiver Chris Blair, wide receiver Dylan Drummond, wide receiver Jesse Matthews, tight end John Fitzpatrick, offensive lineman Andrew Stuber and Julian Davenport, edge rusher Damon Harris, Kenny O'Guiney as well, edge rusher, defensive lineman Zion Logue and LaCale London, cornerbacks Natron Brooks and Kevin King, and safety Dane Cruikshank. So Kenny O'Guiney, as we mentioned the other day, is an international player. He will not count against the 16 player. So technically, I guess you could consider the Falcons will get a 17th player on their practice squad this year. So those 13 plus Kenny O'Guiney leaves 3 spots open. And we'll see what the Falcons do. Usually when this is the situation where the Falcons don't fill it with guys that they waived in the final cuts on Tuesday, which is the case for all of these guys, it's usually because they're going to go outside the organization. And that may mean some veteran signings. That may mean, trying to get somebody else that got cut during the final cut down. So usually that's the indicator, but we'll see how that plays out as the rest of the week unfolds. And for the most part, these signings are pretty much par for the course. Obviously Chris Blair and Kevin King, myself, Corey Woodruff, who was on the podcast earlier at the beginning of this week to talk about the potential cuts. We both had both of those guys making the Falcons 53-man roster, and they didn't in favor of D'Angelo Malone and Javon Gwen. And basically, the assumption was, okay, they'll be back on the practice squad, assuming they did not get claimed. And nobody from the Falcons that they cut on Tuesday got claimed from other teams. And of course, the Falcons did not claim anybody themselves. And so when you look at this list of players, it's like, okay, those were 2 names. And then for me, and again, we didn't talk about this earlier in the week because, wasn't that important to me. But I had in my final predictions, and I know some of you guys won't believe me, but like I did have Carlos Washington, Dylan Drummond, John Fitzpatrick, Andrew Stuber, Julian Davenport, Damon Harris, Kenny O'Guiney, Zion Logue, Natron Brooks, and Dane Cruikshank on my practice squad projections. I had all those guys making it on the practice squad. Now, Jesse Matthews, I did not have. I had OJ Hilaire on my practice squad. LaCale London, I did not have. I had Prince Emili on the practice squad. I also had, filling those last 3 spots, if you're curious, were Anthony Johnson, the cornerback, Trey Vival, the cornerback, and Lucas Dennis, the safety, who was in the first round of cuts on Sunday. So we'll see. Again, not expecting those 3 guys to return in terms of Johnson, Vival, and Dennis. I would say of that, it would be interesting. Johnson was a player that the team was particularly high on early in the summer. I don't think he played particularly well in the preseason, but, we'll see. Vival, was good on special teams. Defensively, he was okay. Like, he didn't really pop that much on defense. And so we'll see if the Falcons want to bring those guys back or any of the other guys in. But again, as I said, more than likely, I think we'll probably see the team go outside the organization. And I think for the most part, like all of these moves make a ton of sense. I think most of these guys did good things in the preseason to the point that you want to sort of see them not only stick on the roster as a potential, stash for later in the season if they're needed to play right away, as well as the potential development that we could see from several of these guys in the future. The thing with the practice squad is, there isn't a rich history of guys sticking on the practice squad and then making the team the next year. It's not as useful for development as I think a lot of people assume it is, because you would just assume like, oh, like half of the players on your practice squad would then make the roster the next year. And it's like usually like 1 or 2, maybe at best. A lot of those guys wind up getting cut. So we'll see how that plays out. But, 1 or 2 exceptions. Zion Logue, for those of you who weren't listening to the podcast earlier in the summer, I have a soft spot for Zion. Like, Eddie Goldman isn't long. Who knows when Eddie Goldman's going to finish the season, right? He buckled down and made it through the summer. But, we just count the days. We count our blessings with Eddie Goldman. So we talked about Zion Logue being sort of that impact nose tackle in the future. LaCale London was the player that we thought would win that battle because we had so many concerns about Eddie Goldman. So it's good to have these 2 young nose tackles waiting in the wings to potentially take on that mantle, further down the road, whether that's later this year or next year or whatever. So those are probably my 2 biggest takeaways. Nice to see John Fitzpatrick still sticking, very up and down preseason, didn't quite make that year 2 jump. Technically, I guess it's year 3 for him. But because he missed his rookie season with an injury, we don't really count that. And of course, Kevin King and Natron Brooks being 2 of the preseason standouts, of course, Chris Blair as well. And so it's nice to see all of these guys come back. And so we'll see what the Falcons do to fill out the rest of this practice squad. Again, Raheem's process of player development, in terms of who plays in the preseason and whatnot, like not too many surprises. Like it was just like once, going through the games and seeing who's, starting in the preseason games, because all the real starters are not playing. And so it's like, you can just kind of guess like, okay, these are the guys that are probably going to stick around. Even if they're not sticking on the roster, they'll probably stick around on the practice squad. So we'll see on that front, guys. But yeah, that's it. Thank you to the Atlanta Falcons for taking as long as you did to announce the practice squad. I wasn't fuming. I wasn't seething. I wasn't pacing up and down my hallway all afternoon waiting for this to drop. So we'll see what other moves are on the horizon. We'll see if the Falcons pick up any additional veterans on their roster as the week unfolds. But we still have lots to talk about in the lead up to week 1. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football, Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.